Okay, hello everyone. I'm Kirsten from the MassRealty communications team. We're here to talk with Emily about the Charles River Watershed Association, which is a conservation organization focused on protecting the Charles River and all its respective green spaces and parks. So this is really interesting for us because we know that healthy watersheds and great green spaces make for healthier and happier residents of an area. So today we're going to speak more about this organization's role in this conservation and in the community. So Emily, could you start just by introducing yourself for everybody?
Sure. My name is Emily Norton, and I am the Executive Director of the Charles River Watershed Association.
Excellent. That's great. So what is the main mission of the organization? What is it that you are all hoping to do?
Yeah, so CRWA was founded in 1965 when the river was super disgusting. And its mission ever since that time has been to protect and restore the Charles River. That's changed a bit over time. Now we have the threat of climate change on top of everything else, but it's still about protecting and restoring the Charles River and its watershed communities.
Right, okay. Complicated running right through a lot of big places to have a clean river, right? Excellent. Okay, so just keeping after that, looking after this river. Just as a general question before we get into the Charles River, why is it so important to protect watersheds?
So first, just to help folks who may not know what a watershed is, when the rain falls on an area of land, whatever body of water that ends up in, whatever river that ends up in, that makes the watershed. So like the Mississippi watershed spans states, but here in Massachusetts, we have 28 watersheds, and the Charles River watershed begins in Hopkinton. For those who aren't familiar with the area, the other famous thing that starts in Hopkinton is the Boston Marathon. So similar to the marathon, the river starts in Hopkinton and then winds its way to Boston. And it's really important to protect a watershed because that's the water quality of your local area. And then in addition, with climate change now, we're seeing there's different parts of the world are seeing different weather extremes. In the Northeast, a big change is hotter summers and also more heavy, intense rainstorms. So when I was a kid growing up in this area, and I'm in the house I grew up in right now, in Newton, Massachusetts. When I was a kid, it was pretty rare to have 90-degree days in the summer. Now it's not rare at all, and that's growing. And then we also got a certain amount of rain, but that amount of rain is really growing as well. And so the problem there is that our stormwater system that collects our stormwater and directs it away from the streets and so forth was not built for the amount of precipitation that we are now receiving. So by protecting the watershed, we can be reducing the amount of flooding. We can be addressing heat island impacts from our heavily built environment. One thing that's sort of interesting in when I took over here about 3 years ago, even though I'd grown up in this area, I wasn't really as knowledgeable about the history, the ecological history of it. And when you think about a lot of the names of communities in Massachusetts, so Watertown, Swampscott, Millbury, many of them have water in their name. Marshfield, many of them have water in their names because naturally this area was super watery before Europeans arrived. And in order to have our modern lives and a built environment and roads and buildings and tennis courts and so on, we covered up a lot of those water areas. We filled in, we used to call them swamps, wetlands. We put rivers and streams into culverts. Some of them we just bulldozed over. And that's allowed us to live the way we live now, but that's coming back to bite us in a climate change era with more rain. So, sorry, I'm getting a call.
That's okay.
So that's another reason that we want to be protecting, that we want to be. So one of the main things we want to be doing is when it's possible, we want to be restoring the natural hydrology, because as we have a heavily built up environment, when the water, and I know this is one of your later questions, but when the water hits asphalt and roads and buildings, it goes directly into the storm drains and it carries all the garbage and crap and pollutants that are on those asphalt and concrete surfaces, carries that right into the river. So by restoring our natural hydrology, sort of bringing nature back into our built environment with bioswales and rain gardens and permeable pavers and more trees and protecting our tree canopy, we can be cleaning that water before it gets to the river, and we can also be holding it in and reducing flooding to at least some extent.
Right. So for a lot of people, we think of it as a river, but what we have to think about is that the water comes from all over the place. It comes from the storm drains, it comes from the farmer's fields. So it's a pretty big job that your organization has just to try to keep all of this running smoothly.
Yeah, and I think we saw, I mean, this is always the case, but having seen what just happened in Texas, we do take for granted the basic amenities that we have, whether it's our energy, our water, our clean water coming in, our sewage going out, and we can't go hours without that. So,
Right.
So we do need to really protect it. And sometimes it's the thing, and depending on what community you're in, people in Massachusetts might complain about their water bills, and it's like, imagine if you didn't have this amenity. What is it really worth it to you?
Right.
So yeah, so it is a challenge. I think that people take for granted what we have, and how much they're willing to pay for it. And also that a lot of the things that we need to do to clean up the river even further and protect the watershed further are super sciencey and engineering. So if that's not your background, you don't really understand it. My other gig is I also serve as a city councilor in my hometown of Newton. So that's part-time, obviously. And so, but that gives me sort of an insight into both sort of worlds, where in the advocacy world, I'm at CRWA, but then also a lot of the people that we advocate to, sort of elected officials, if you don't have a background in science, if you're not a hydrologist, then it can be hard to grasp why you need to take certain steps. And like, say, Holliston, they don't have the river running through them, though they're in our watershed. So I don't think people there, they could be forgiven if they didn't feel particularly connected to the Charles River the way someone in Newton or Cambridge or Boston would when it runs right through the community.
Right. So we're all really a lot more connected than we like to think we are, I think. So what we need is organizations like you guys that come and connect citizens with organizations, with governments, and just to help us run a little bit more smoothly and protect these areas. That's awesome. So you did mention a couple of the towns and places that the Charles River does run through, but what are all of the different places that run through for somebody who maybe is thinking about moving to the area but has no idea?
Yeah, so it really, like I said, it starts in Hopkinton and kind of winds its way to Boston. It goes directly through 23 cities and towns, but 35 are in the watershed. But for those who would want to, be able to live right along the river or near the river, I don't have the list right in front of me, so I'm probably not going to remember them all. But Boston, Cambridge, Watertown, Waltham, Newton, Dover, Needham, Medfield, Millis, Franklin, I'm sure there's
right. So there's a lot of them. I mean, towns like to be close to rivers, right? It's a necessary resource, so we tend to develop on the riverbank.
Yes.
That's cool. Great. So I was looking a little bit into your website, and I saw that the Charles River is considered one of the cleanest urban rivers in America now. Thanks to you guys, essentially, because as you said, when you started this organization, not you, but when the organization started.
Yes, I was not alive in 1965. Thank you, Kirsten.
I'm sorry about that.
All good.
So what kind of efforts has this required, and what kind of things do you and the organization have to do to help clean up this river, and what has been the history?
Yeah, it's actually a really inspirational story. I think that the story of the Charles River cleanup, particularly now when we have so many environmental challenges and it can feel overwhelming and just not doable. So the history is just fascinating to read. But for decades, if not centuries, but certainly decades, when there was more of a modern awareness about the need to even care about the environment, people in this area had completely given up on the Charles. And there are numerous reports to that effect. And so this organization was founded in 1965 by a group of people who were like, nope, we're not going to accept that. And so in the early days, there was just a lot of advocacy and awareness raising that this is something that even should be done. Their efforts got a huge boost with the passage of the Clean Water Act in 1972, because at that point, then organizations or individuals or governments had leverage. Mm-hmm. But even still, our legislature in Massachusetts did not act. We knew how dirty the Charles was, but if you read the history, there was just a lot of passing the buck year after year. What it took eventually was the city solicitor of Quincy, Massachusetts. Now, Quincy is not in the watershed, but his name was Bill Golden, and he was running along Wollaston Beach, and sort of a renowned story. And he was just disgusted by running in sewage. And so the city of Quincy actually sued the state under the Clean Water Act. And that put in motion what eventually became the Boston Harbor cleanup, which was a massive, massive effort. And obviously the Charles is not the only water body leading into the Boston Harbor, but we are a major one. So as a result of that Boston Harbor cleanup litigation, there were requirements to clean up the Charles. And our role in particular was to not only to keep the pressure on to do it right, but also to bring data and science into how we did it. So there were just, and my predecessor, Bob Zimmerman, tells these wonderful stories, but they didn't really know even where the Charles was polluted. There were these assumptions that the whole thing was polluted. So CRWA did studies to identify, actually, these are the areas, and upstream it's pretty clean. And there were also efforts along the way. It was not one linear path with this litigation of what the solutions would look like and how much they would cost. And there were, for example, efforts to treat the sewage that was going into the river rather than remove it. Which I should have mentioned earlier in terms of what was making the river so dirty. You had sewage, literally raw human sewage. You had decades of industrial waste. Remember, there were so many mills along the river and dams along the river because of all the industry. You had slaughterhouses and slaughterhouse waste. You literally had municipal dumps along the Charles.
Along the water.
Yeah, we literally treated the river like a dump. We didn't treat it like this wonderful amenity. And I can tell you, when I was a kid, it was not that unusual to be able to smell sewage if you were near the harbor or near the river. So we've definitely come a long way, and there are people alive today who can remember that. Right. So it took a lot of litigation, it took a lot of advocacy, and that's still the case. Our work is not done. The amount of sewage going into the harbor and the river has been reduced significantly. It's not at zero. So we still have some work to do there, but it's over 90%. So it's a huge improvement. Now the sort of two biggest threats to the Charles are stormwater runoff, as we discussed earlier, carrying all this, pollutants into it, gasoline drips, just everything that goes on the road ends up in the Charles River because, stormwater is not treated before it goes into the Charles, and climate change. So climate change with droughts are really bad for rivers. When they're bringing these more intense rainstorms, when we do still have parts of Boston and Cambridge in particular, where there are still some, it's called combined sewer overflows, where you have combined sewer pipes with stormwater pipes during heavy rains, that all carries raw sewage into the river, because if not, the way they're designed, it would back up into people's homes, which we definitely don't want. Right. So our work is not done, but that it really, and like I said, it was close to $5 billion, the Boston Harbor cleanup, but it's really transformed the whole metropolitan Boston area. You have, I know this is going to be for people considering moving here, but the Esplanade is this amazing jewel of a park that you would not have wanted to sit next to back in the day. The Seaport is this very successful commercial area of Boston now that would not have been, because it's right in the harbor, that would not have been something that anyone would have wanted to put a fancy commercial building next to in the old days. So, and biking along the Charles, running along the Charles, rowing or kayaking in the Charles, it's just a major part of the quality of life here that wouldn't have been possible if it wasn't for litigation and for people not giving up on this river.
Right. That's so interesting. Boston and metropolitan Boston, greater Boston area has so much rich history in terms of a lot of things, but it's great to see too that it has this environmental advocacy history as well, and people that really care about their backyards, which is a big thing. And I think it's really a luxury because there's a lot of people that live in large cities that have rivers running through it. And as you say, they're not places that you want to go sit down by the river because they're dirty and polluted. So it's really incredible to have a beautiful river, even if there's a little ways to go. Of course, your job isn't done yet, but to have this amazing space to enjoy and to be able to kayak in there and have all these different recreation opportunities, that's really something that I'm sure even if people maybe don't appreciate it directly to you guys, that people do really appreciate it. I'm sure you can see your work every day, how valuable that is. That's excellent.
Very much, very much. I know when we talk about our fundraising ideas, one of my board members was like, look at all the companies with Charles River in their name. They should all be donating to us.
Right,
Want to be
exactly.
associated
So
with the river
that's a
the way it
quick
used to
plug
be.
for donations to the Charles River Association, if you're listening. That's awesome. So other than just the obvious benefits of a clean river, that you can use it for recreation, that it doesn't smell, what are some of the other like bonus benefits of a cleaner river that we could talk about?
Well, there's benefits to the non-human inhabitants. The cleaner the river is, the more wildlife it can support. And we actually do a lot of water quality monitoring. And one of the types we do is actually looking at the bugs. Various different types of macroinvertebrates can show you how clean your river is. So we know that it is getting cleaner from those studies that we do, but particularly for those who spend time along the river, you'll see turtles, eagles, great blue herons, deer, beavers, muskrat, mink. And there are parts of the river when you're kayaking or canoeing where you can barely hear the road. You can't see any other people. Like, you can sometimes pretend it's 500 years ago on certain parts of the river, even though you're in, a pretty developed area.
Right. Yeah. More and more comes out every day how important this time is in nature. And there's a bunch of health studies linked to seeing wildlife and animals and that kind of thing. And I know some people might say, oh, more bugs, but more bugs means more birds and more small mammals and those things. So that's really incredible, and it's super important. And it's so nice to have that tiny little escape from the city, for sure. I'm sure people would love that. I know I definitely really treasure the small areas in the city that I live in that you can escape and pretend that you're out in the bush, especially in times like this where travel isn't as possible. I think it's really important to have these special areas you can go to.
But that actually leads to another thing that we work on is making sure that there continues to be public access to the river. Mm-hmm. Because as we've cleaned up the river further, people there's more interest in development along the river and closing off public access. So you always have to fight to make sure that the public has access and it's not closed off for whether it's universities or companies or individuals who would want to close off access. Not that there's access to the entire river, but you don't want to lose the access that we have now.
Right. Okay. So that's important to note too.
Yeah. And when there is a development project, CRWA always fights and advocates to restore the riverbank, restore the river in that area, and then make sure that there's public access and ideally even educational placards so that people know, like, oh, this green infrastructure as part of this development is actually part of cleaning up the river. Because the more people understand, then the more they're going to support the investments that are necessary for further restoration.
Right. Education and communication is really key. That's great. So people can walk along the river then even and have a little educational trip on their own as they go then, essentially. Yeah, that's excellent. Awesome. So in terms of all of these different projects and different things you do, what can the community do to be involved in your project, and how can people help on an individual level?
Yeah, so we have many ways for people to get involved. We do, as you can imagine, it's a little bit been different during the pandemic.
Of course.
But we do an annual Earth Day cleanup in partnership with other Charles River organizations such as Charles River Conservancy, the Esplanade Association, Emerald Necklace Conservancy. We all work together on this big Earth Day cleanup. We are going to be having it this year. It will be, you more sort of go out on your own and we'll provide bags. And so it's not one big group thing, but we will be doing that again as soon as we can. We have invasive pulls where you can go out into the river and yank water chestnuts out. It's very satisfying. I very much enjoy it. Or invasive pulls on the land. Terrestrial invasive species are endemic, unfortunately. We encourage people on their own in terms of, on your own property to conserve water, get a rain barrel, build rain gardens. There's plant pollinator species. There's so many things you can do. Don't cut down trees, preserve your trees. That really helps with some of the things that we were talking about, water quality and heat island and so forth. But in addition, if you, for those who are comfortable, talking to your elected officials at any level, your local level, your state level, Congress, whatever, to say, so I'm looking at the impacts of climate change that are already here and coming. What are you doing to protect us? Because
Right.
there's so much more that we need to be doing. When people think of climate change and climate change impacts from storms, they think of coastal storm surge and the beaches that are being eroded and so forth. But simply from rain alone, we are already seeing, and we are going to see even more and more flooding. If you remember Hurricane Irene and all the damage it caused in Vermont, well, Vermont is nowhere near the ocean.
Right.
We have those risks here in the Charles River watershed area as well. So we're going to need to be investing in more ways to hold the water and protect people and property from what's coming.
Right. So the bad news is there's a lot of difficult things going on, but the good news is that people can do something. And we have these organizations like you guys to reach out to. You can reach out to your officials and just do your part as well on an individual level. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for all of that super great information and for joining me today. And for anybody watching, if you would like to do an interview with us, talking about your neighborhood, park, museum, establishment, or organization, go ahead and check out the link that we have in the description and we can have a chat. Until next time.